The two-lane highway stretched through North Carolina like a scar across weathered skin, pine trees swaying in the late summer heat. Helen Monroe gripped the steering wheel of her battered van, her knuckles white against the cracked vinyl. The engine had been making that sound again, a wheeze that reminded her of her father's last breaths in the VA hospital. She wasn't supposed to be here. Hell, she wasn't supposed to be anywhere. For 3 years, the van had sat in her driveway in Portland, Oregon, collecting dust and judgment from neighbors who whispered about the crazy veteran lady who never left her house. The grocery deliveries, the closed curtains, the way she'd duck behind her mailbox when kids walked by, it all painted a picture she'd grown comfortable hiding behind. But then the letter came. Helen pulled over at her rest stop and unfolded the worn piece of paper for the 100th time. The handwriting was shaky, but unmistakably real. Mrs. Monroe, my name is David Lawson. I was with the 82nd Airborne in Afghanistan. 2010. Your friend Rachel Dawson saved my life in Jowers Valley. Before she died, she made me promise to find you if I ever made it home. She said you'd understand what that meant. The letter had been waiting for her for 2 years. David had tracked her down through VA records, persistent as a bloodhound. In his final paragraph, he'd written something that made her hand shake. She said you'd promised to take her picture across the country, to see what you both fought for. She said you'd chicken out, but that someone would have to remind you that promises to the dead are the only ones that really matter. Rachel's photograph sat propped against the dashboard, now 2 young women in combat gear, grinning like they owned the world. The photo had been taken 3 days before the mission that changed everything, before the valley, before the choice that still woke Helen up screaming. The van coughed, sputtered, then died completely. No, Helen muttered, coasting toward the shoulder. Steam rose from under the hood like a surrender flag. She managed to pull off near a chain-link fence, close enough to see the military checkpoint in the distance. A sign read, Fort Liberty, authorized personnel only. She popped the hood and stared at the mess of hoses and metal. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the rhythmic sound of soldiers marching, their cadence echoing across the hot asphalt. It was a sound that used to comfort her. Now it just reminded her of everything she'd lost. Helen crawled under the van with her toolbox, sweat already beading on her forehead. The gravel bit into her knees, but she'd endured worse. As she worked, she found herself talking to the photograph. I know what you're thinking, Rachel. Took you long enough, Helen. Well, better late than never, right? She didn't notice the military Humvee approaching until it was too late. 3 soldiers climbed out, their boots crunching on the gravel. They were young, maybe 22 at most, with the kind of crisp uniforms and serious expressions that screamed fresh out of basic training. Ma'am, the tallest one called out, his voice carrying that particular blend of authority and uncertainty that comes with new stripes. This is a restricted area. You can't park here. Helen didn't look up from her work. Didn't park. Broke. Down. Doesn't matter. Another soldier chimed in, consulting his clipboard like it held the secrets of the universe. This is federal property. You'll need to call a tow truck and move along. I'm fixing it, Helen said simply, her wrench finding purchase on a stubborn bolt. Give me 15 minutes. That's not how this works, ma'am. The clipboard soldier's voice took on an edge. We can't allow unauthorized personnel to loiter near the perimeter. It's a security risk. Helen slid out from under the van, wiping her hands on her jeans. Her tank top was soaked with sweat, and she could feel the familiar ache in her lower back, a gif from that IED outside Kandahar. She looked at the 3 soldiers, seeing herself in their eager faces. I'm not loitering, she said calmly. I'm stranded. Big difference. The 3rd soldier, who'd been quiet until now, stepped forward. Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step away from the vehicle. We're calling this in." It was then that Helen felt it, that old familiar burn in her chest. The same feeling she'd had when bureaucrats at the VA told her that her PTSD claim was inconclusive. The same feeling when her own family had stopped calling because she was too difficult to be around. But this time, she didn't back down. "Call whoever you want," she said, her voice steady but firm. "I'm not moving until this van is running. And I'm not abandoning it like—" She stopped herself, the words catching in her throat. "Like I abandoned her." The soldiers exchanged glances, uncertainty creeping into their professional facades. The tallest one reached for his radio, but before he could speak, the sound of approaching tires cut through the afternoon heat. A black SUV with government plates pulled up slowly, its windows tinted dark enough to hide secrets. Helen's heart began to race, but not from fear. Something about the vehicle's measured approach, the way it positioned itself with clear sightlines, it reminded her of the way Rachel used to scout a perimeter. The engine shut off, and for a moment, the only sound was the distant echo of military cadence and the tick-tick-tick of cooling metal. Helen glanced at the photograph on her dashboard, Rachel's smile seeming to wink in the afternoon sun. "Well, girl," she whispered, "looks like this is where it gets interesting." The SUV's door opened with the soft thunk of expensive engineering, and General Marcus Hayward stepped out into the North Carolina heat. Helen could read rank and authority in the way he moved, measured, deliberate, like a man who'd learned that every gesture carried weight. The three soldiers snapped to attention so fast Helen thought they might give themselves whiplash. "What's the situation here, Corporal?" Hayward asked, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made people listen without being told. "2. Sir, we have a perimeter breach." The clipboard soldier, apparently the corporal, replied. "Civilian vehicle broken down in the restricted zone. Subject is refusing to comply with orders to evacuate." Helen almost laughed at being called a subject, but something in the general's posture made her pause. He was scanning the scene with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen real conflict, not just peacetime exercises. "I see," Hayward said, his gaze moving from the soldiers to Helen, then to her van. "And the nature of the mechanical failure?" "Sir, that's not really," the corporal began. "Coolin' hose," Helen interrupted, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. "Cracked fitting. 20-minute fix if these boys would stop treating me like a terrorist." One of the younger soldiers bristled. "Ma'am, we're just following protocol." "Protocol," Helen repeated, and there was something in her voice that made the words sound like a curse. "You know what protocol got me? A Purple Heart and a medical discharge. You know what it got my best friend? A flag and a grave." The general's eyes sharpened. Something in Helen's tone, her posture, the way she carried herself, despite the grease stains and sweat, it was familiar. Professional. "Corporal," Hayward said quietly, "give me a moment with the lady." The three soldiers stepped back, though Helen could see them watching from the corner of their eyes. Hayward approached slowly, his hands visible, and relaxed the body language of someone who understood that respect was earned, not demanded. "You served," he said. It wasn't a question. Helen nodded, her jaw tight. 12 years, until I couldn't anymore." "What unit?" For a moment, Helen considered lying or deflecting. It would be easier than explaining something that officially never existed. But the way Hayward asked, with genuine curiosity rather than interrogation, made her decision for her. She pulled the strap of her tank top aside slightly, revealing the edge of her tattoo. A black skull inside a weathered silver shield, wings barely visible beneath the fabric. Hayward's breath caught. His eyes widened for just a moment before professional composure reasserted itself. "Ghost Company 7, he said quietly. "You've heard of us?" "I served with Bravo Group, 2010. Firebase Kestrel. He paused, studying her face. You're Helen Monroe. The name hung in the air between them like a dropped grenade. Helen felt her chest tighten. She'd spent 3 years trying to forget that name, to bury it under layers of isolation and self-medication. But here it was, spoken with something that sounded almost like reverence. I was, she said finally. Now I'm just someone trying to keep a promise. Hayward's expression softened. Rachel Dawson. Helen's composure cracked for just a moment. You knew her? I knew of her. We all did. The woman who held Jow's Valley while the rest of us got our people out. He glanced at the photograph visible through the van's windshield. She's the reason 32 soldiers made it home. She's the reason I'm still here, Helen said, her voice barely above a whisper. The general stood in silence for a moment. Then slowly, deliberately, he raised his right hand to his temple in a perfect salute. Sharp, precise, and filled with the kind of respect that can't be faked. Behind him, the 3 young soldiers watched in stunned silence as their commanding officer saluted a woman in a greasy tank top. Helen felt tears prick at her eyes. She hadn't been saluted in 3 years. Hadn't been seen as anything other than a problem to be managed or a case to be closed. But here, on a hot stretch of North Carolina asphalt, a general was acknowledging not just her service, but her sacrifice. She straightened her shoulders and returned the salute. Corporal, Hayward said, without breaking eye contact with Helen. I want a mechanic from the motor pool here in 10 minutes. Full service, whatever she needs. Sir, yes, sir, the corporal stammered. And Corporal? Hayward's voice carried a warning. This woman is to be treated with the same respect you'd show me. Is that understood? Yes, sir. Absolutely, sir. As the soldiers hurried to their radio, Hayward turned back to Helen. I'm sorry about your friend. And I'm sorry it took 3 years for someone to recognize what you've been carrying. Helen wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving a streak of grease across her cheek. I'm not looking for sympathy, General. I'm just trying to get to Tennessee. Where are you headed after that? Everywhere, Helen said, glancing at Rachel's photograph. Every state. Every town. She made me promise to see what we fought for. To understand what freedom really looks like. Hayward nodded slowly. That's a hell of a promise to keep. It's the only one that matters. In the distance, they could hear the sound of an approaching vehicle. The motor pool mechanic, Helen assumed. But for now, in this moment, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Recognition. Not pity, not concern, but genuine acknowledgement of who she'd been and what she'd lost. General, she said quietly, thank you for seeing me. Ma'am, he replied, it's an honor. As the mechanic's truck pulled up, Helen looked once more at Rachel's photograph. For the first time since leaving Portland, she felt like she might actually be able to keep her promise. But she also felt something else, a nagging sensation that this encounter was just the beginning of something larger. Something that would force her to confront not just her past, but the question of what came next. The van's engine might be fixable, but Helen was beginning to realize that some things some people couldn't be repaired. They could only be reborn. The motor pool mechanic, a weathered staff sergeant named Tommy Rodriguez, worked with the efficiency of someone who'd spent 20 years keeping military vehicles running. Helen watched him from the shade of a pine tree, sipping water from a bottle General Hayward had produced from his SUV. Your friend knew her stuff, Rodriguez called out, his voice muffled by the van's hood. This jury rigging is military grade. Whoever taught her to work on engines knew what they were doing. She taught herself, Helen said quietly. Always. Said you can't depend on other people to keep you moving. Smart woman. Rodriguez straightened up, wiping his hands on a rag. This'll run another 100,000 miles, easy. Just needed some TLC. General Hayward checked his watch. Sergeant, when you're finished, Would you mind giving Mrs. Monroe a full inspection? I want to make sure she's road ready. All ready. On it, sir. Helen studied Hayward's profile as he watched Rodriguez work. There was something deliberate about his attention, like he was buying time for something. She'd seen that look before, usually right before someone dropped bad news or made a request that couldn't be refused. General, she said carefully, I appreciate the help, but I get the feeling there's something you're not telling me. Hayward smiled grimly. 12 years of service, and you still read people like tactical manuals. Some things never change. So what is it? I've been in command of this base for 2 years, he said, settling against the SUV's bumper. Good soldiers, solid training, but they're missing something. Something I can't teach them in a classroom or a field exercise. Helen raised an eyebrow. And that is understanding. About what service really means. About what it costs. He paused, watching a formation of soldiers march past in the distance. These kids, they know the manual. They know the drills. But they don't know why any of it matters. And you think I do? I think you and Rachel Dawson paid a price that most people can't comprehend. And I think there's value in that story being told. Helen felt the familiar tightness in her chest. I'm not a motivational speaker, General. I'm barely functional most days. That's exactly why they need to hear from you. No, the word came out harder than Helen intended. I'm not performing my trauma for a bunch of kids who think war is Call of Duty with better graphics. Hayward's expression didn't change, but Helen caught a flicker of something disappointment? Frustration? It was gone before she could identify it. I understand, he said simply, but the offer stands. If you change your mind, Rodriguez slammed the hood shut. She's ready to roll, ma'am. Changed the oil, topped off the fluids, even patched that small leak in your exhaust. Should purr like a kitten. Helen pushed herself off the tree and walked toward the van. The sun was starting to lower, casting long shadows across the asphalt. She needed to get moving if she wanted to make Tennessee before dark. Thank you, Sergeant, she said, shaking Rodriguez's hand. And thank you, General, for everything. Safe travels, Mrs. Monroe, and remember, the offer stands. Helen climbed into the van and started the engine. Rodriguez was right. It purred. She put it in drive, and it started to pull away when she caught sight of the 3 soldiers from earlier. They were standing at attention beside their Humvee, and as she passed, they saluted in unison. It was a small gesture, but it hit Helen harder than she expected. She pulled over about a mile down the road, her hand shaking as she gripped the steering wheel. Damn it, Rachel, she whispered to the photograph. What am I supposed to do with this? The photo didn't answer, but Helen could almost hear Rachel's voice. You're supposed to stop being a coward and start being who you used to be. Helen sat there for a long time, watching the sun sink lower over the trees. She thought about the young soldiers, about their earnest faces and crisp uniforms. She thought about herself at their age, full of conviction and certainty about right and wrong. She thought about the moment in Jowler's Valley when that certainty had died along with her best friend. Finally, she picked up her phone and dialed. The number on the business card General Hayward had pressed into her hand. Fort Liberty, General Hayward's office. This is Helen Monroe. I need to speak with the general. One moment, please. Hayward's voice came on the line almost immediately. Mrs. Monroe? Your offer, Helen said, her voice steady despite the chaos in her chest. I'll do it, but I have conditions. Name them. No cameras, no press, no ceremony. Just soldiers who want to listen. Done. And I tell the story my way. The real story. Not some sanitized version that makes everyone feel good about themselves. I wouldn't want it any other way. Helen closed her eyes, feeling like she was standing at the edge of a cliff. Tomorrow morning. 1 hour, then I'm gone. Thank you, Mrs. Monroe. You have no idea what this means. I hope you're right about that, General. Because if this goes wrong, I'm taking you down with me." Hayward's laugh was warm and genuine. "Ma'am, I've been in worse foxholes with less reliable allies. I'll take my chances." Helen hung up the phone and looked at Rachel's photograph one more time. "Okay, girl," she said quietly. "Let's see if I remember how to be brave." Helen didn't sleep well that night. She'd found a small motel 20 minutes from the base, the kind of place that rented rooms by the hour and didn't ask questions about guests who paid cash. She lay on the thin mattress, staring at the water-stained ceiling, listening to the hum of the air conditioner that worked about as well as her own emotional thermostat. At 0500, she gave up on sleep and drove back to Fort Liberty. The base was already alive with morning activity. Soldiers jogged in formation, their cadence echoing across the parade ground. Fresh-faced kids heading to chow halls and equipment checks, probably complaining about the early hour while secretly loving the sense of purpose it gave them. Helen remembered that feeling, the certainty that came with belonging to something bigger than yourself. Before she learned that sometimes the thing you belonged to could abandon you when you needed it most. General Hayward met her at the gate, 2 cups of coffee in his hands. "Black, no sugar," he said, offering her one. "Sergeant Rodriguez mentioned that's how you take it." "Good intel," Helen said, accepting the cup. The coffee was strong and bitter, exactly what she needed. "Where are we doing this?" "Conference room in the training building. About 60 soldiers, all volunteers. Mix of ranks and experience levels." 60? Helen's stomach clenched. "You said small group. For an army base, 60 is intimate. Most of these presentations are for hundreds." Helen took a long sip of coffee, using the time to steady herself. "What did you tell them?" "That they were going to hear from someone who'd been where they might be going. Someone who understood the cost of service in a way that most people never would. And they volunteered for that? Standing room only. Had to turn people away." They walked across the base in comfortable silence, Helen's boots crunching on the gravel paths she'd once known by heart. Every military installation had the same rhythm, the same energy. It was like coming home to a place you'd never wanted to leave. The training building was a squat concrete structure that had probably been built in the 1960s and updated with the bare minimum required to keep it functional. Hayward led her to a side door marked Conference Room B, where she could hear the low murmur of conversation. "You ready?" he asked. Helen thought about Rachel's last words to her, spoken over a crackling radio with gunfire in the background. "Don't you dare waste this, Helen. Don't you dare waste what I'm giving you." "No," she said, "but I'm going anyway." Hayward opened the door, and Helen stepped into a room that fell silent the moment she appeared. 60 soldiers, just as promised. Young faces, older faces, but all of them focused on her with the kind of attention that made her skin crawl. She walked to the front of the room, where someone had set up a small podium with a microphone. Helen looked at it, then pushed it aside and perched on the edge of the desk instead. "I'm not going to use this," she said, her voice carrying easily across the room. "If you can't hear me, raise your hand and I'll speak up." A few nervous chuckles, but mostly silence. Helen scanned the room, taking in the faces. Some eager, some skeptical, some that reminded her painfully of herself at their age. "General Hayward asked me to talk to you about service," she began. "About what it means and what it costs." I told him I wasn't qualified, but he insisted. "So here's what I want you to understand right up front. I'm not here to inspire you. I'm not here to make you feel good about your choices. I'm here to tell you a story about what happens when the system you serve decides you're expendable." The room was dead quiet now. Helen could see a few soldiers shifting uncomfortably in their seats, but no one looked away. 12 years ago, I was part of a unit that officially never existed. We called ourselves Ghost Company 7, and we did the jobs that regular units couldn't do. The jobs that required complete deniability if things went wrong. Helen reached into her pocket and pulled out a small photograph, not the one from her dashboard, but another one. This one showed 7 soldiers in full combat gear, faces painted with camouflage, eyes hard with the kind of confidence that comes from surviving things that would break most people. This was taken 3 days before the mission that ended my military career, she said, holding up the photo. 7 of us went into Jalars Valley in Afghanistan to extract intelligence from a compound that was supposed to be lightly defended. What we found instead was a trap that cost the lives of 5 American soldiers and changed everything I thought I knew about duty and honor. She paused, letting the weight of those words settle over the room. The woman sitting next to me in this picture is Rachel Dawson. She was my best friend, my battle buddy, and the bravest person I've ever known. She died in that valley, and for 3 years, I've been telling myself it was her choice. That she chose to sacrifice herself for the mission, for the greater good, for all the reasons we tell ourselves when we need to sleep at night. Helen's voice cracked slightly, but she pushed through it. But the truth is, she died because the people who sent us there lied. They knew it was a trap. They knew we were walking into an ambush. And they sent us anyway because Ghost Company 7 was expendable. Because sometimes the system needs martyrs more than it needs heroes. The silence in the room was absolute now. Helen could see the shock on some faces, the recognition on others. These were soldiers who'd heard the rumors, who'd wondered about the operations that never made it into the history books. So here's what I want you to understand, Helen continued, her voice growing stronger. The system you serve is flawed. It's run by people who make mistakes, who have agendas, who sometimes prioritize politics over people. And someday, some of you are going to be asked to pay the price for those mistakes. She stood up from the desk, her gaze sweeping across the room. But that doesn't mean your service doesn't matter. It doesn't mean the sacrifices you're willing to make are meaningless. It just means you need to understand what you're really fighting for. Not for the politicians or the generals or the people who send you into harm's way. You fight for each other. You fight for the person standing next to you. Because at the end of the day, that's the only thing that's real. That's the only thing that matters. Helen picked up Rachel's photograph from the dashboard shot and held it up. Rachel Dawson fought for me. She died so I could live, so I could come home and tell this story. And for 3 years, I dishonored that sacrifice by hiding from the world, by letting the system break me instead of fighting back. She looked directly at General Hayward, who was standing at the back of the room. But I'm not hiding anymore. I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure Rachel's sacrifice means something. Making sure that the people who send you into harm's way understand that your lives have value beyond what they can accomplish on a battlefield. Helen folded the photograph carefully and put it back in her pocket. That's my story, she said. Simply, take from it what you will. But remember this, you're not just soldiers. You're human beings with families and dreams and futures that matter. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. She started to walk toward the door, then paused and turned back. And if anyone in this room ever finds themselves in a situation where they're being asked to choose between the mission and their people, remember Rachel Dawson. Remember that sometimes the most heroic thing you can do is refuse to let the system turn you into a casualty. Helen walked out of the room and didn't look back. Behind her, she could hear the sound of chairs scraping against the floor as 60 soldiers rose to their feet in silent salute. Helen made it halfway to her van before General Hayward caught up with her. His face was flushed, whether from running or emotion, she couldn't tell. That wasn't what I expected, he said, slightly out of breath. Good. Expectations are what get people killed. Helen, wait. He grabbed her elbow gently. not restraining, but asking for her attention. What you just did in there was a mistake, she finished. I knew it the moment I walked in. Those kids don't need to hear about how broken the system is. They need to believe in something. No, Hayward said firmly. They need to hear the truth. They need to understand what they're really signing up for. Helen pulled her arm free and continued walking toward the van. What they need is to stay innocent as long as possible. What I just did was take that away from them. You gave them something more valuable than innocence. You gave them wisdom. Wisdom? Helen laughed bitterly. I gave them nightmares. I gave them doubt. I gave them the same poison that's been eating at me for 3 years. They reached the van, and Helen fumbled with her keys, her hand shaking slightly. The adrenaline from the presentation was wearing off, leaving her feeling hollow and exposed. You know what the worst part is? She said, not looking at Hayward. I actually felt good up there. For the first time in 3 years, I felt like I had a purpose. Like I was honoring Rachel's memory by telling the truth about what happened. To us. Because you were. No, I was just spreading my own bitterness, my own inability to move on. She finally got the key in the lock and opened the van door. Rachel would have hated what I just did. She believed in the mission, even at the end. She believed in the system, even when it failed her. Hayward was quiet for a long moment, then said, You know, I was there when the after-action report came in from Jallows Valley. I was the one who had to brief the families. Helen froze, her hand on the door handle. What you don't know, Hayward continued, is that your friend's last communication wasn't tactical. It wasn't about the mission or the enemy positions. It was about you. Helen turned slowly, her eyes searching his face. She told the pilot to make sure Helen Monroe made it home. She said you had a story to tell, and that the story mattered more than the mission. Hayward's voice was gentle but firm. She didn't sacrifice herself for the system, Helen. She sacrificed herself for you, for your voice, for your ability to tell the truth about what happened. Helen felt her knees go weak. She leaned against the van, struggling to process what she'd just heard. That's not possible, she whispered. The radio was damaged. Communications were down. Emergency frequency. Single transmission. Clear as day. Hayward pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts. I can put you in touch with the pilot if you want to hear it for yourself. Helen shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I donned single quotes to ... I can't. You've been carrying guilt that doesn't belong to you, Hayward said quietly. Rachel didn't die because the system failed her. She died because she chose to save you. Because she knew you were the one who could make sure her death meant something. For 3 years, Helen had been tormented by the image of Rachel dying alone, abandoned by the system they'd both served. But now, hearing Hayward's words, she realized she'd been carrying the wrong burden. Rachel hadn't died as a victim of the system. She'd died as its conscience. Why didn't anyone tell me this before? Helen asked. Because the mission was classified. Because the report was buried. Because the people who knew were sworn to secrecy. Hayward paused. I'm probably violating about 12 different regulations. By telling you now. Helen wiped her eyes and looked back toward the training building. Through the windows, she could see soldiers still milling around. Some in small groups, others standing alone. They were processing what they'd heard, trying to fit it into their understanding of military service. I need to go back in there, she said suddenly. Helen, you don't have to. Yes, I do. I left them with questions, but no answers. I told them the system was broken, but didn't give them any way to fix it. She started walking back toward the building, Hayward falling into step beside her. What are you going to tell them? Helen thought about Rachel's last words, about the choice her friend had made, about the weight of carrying someone else's sacrifice. The truth, she said. All of it. the good and the bad, the ways the system fails and the ways it succeeds, the importance of questioning authority and the importance of believing in something bigger than yourself. That's a lot to balance. That's what wisdom is, Helen said, surprising herself with the words. It's not about having all the answers. It's about understanding that the questions are complicated and that simple answers usually aren't good. Enough. They reached the building, and Helen paused at the door. Through the glass, she could see the soldiers still gathered in the conference room, some arguing quietly, others sitting in contemplative silence. Rachel made a choice, she said to Hayward. She chose to save me because she believed I had something important to say. For 3 years, I've been dishonoring that choice by staying silent, by hiding. And now? Helen squared her shoulders and reached for the door handle. Now I'm going to start earning the life she gave me. She opened the door and stepped back into the room. 60 pairs of eyes turned toward her, and she could see the confusion and uncertainty in their faces. But she could also see something else, hope. The possibility that maybe, just maybe, she had more to offer than just criticism and doubt. I know what you're thinking, she said, her voice carrying clearly across the room. You're wondering if everything you believe in is a lie. If the system you've sworn to serve is worth the sacrifices you are willing to make. She walked to the front of the room and sat on the edge of the desk again. I can't answer that question for you. I can't answer that question for you. But I can tell you this. The system is only as good as the people who choose to serve it. And if you're in this room, if you volunteered to hear this story, then you're the kind of people who can make it better. The room was silent, but Helen could feel the attention, the engagement. These weren't just kids playing soldier anymore. They were adults grappling with adult questions about duty and honor and the price of service. My friend Rachel Dawson died to save my life, Helen continued. But more than that, she died to save my voice. She knew that I would have questions about what happened to us, about the choices that were made, about the price we paid. And she wanted me to be alive to ask those questions. Helen stood up and began pacing slowly across the front of the room. That's what I'm asking you to do. Ask questions. Hold the system accountable. Demand better from your leaders. But don't let cynicism replace commitment. Don't let doubt replace dedication. Because at the end of the day, the system is just a collection of people making choices. And if you're not part of making those choices, then you're just letting other people decide what your service means. She stopped pacing and looked directly at the soldiers in the front row. Rachel Dawson chose to die for something she believed in. Not because she was naive or brainwashed, but because she understood that someone had to be willing to pay the price for the values we claim to defend. Freedom, justice, the protection of those who can't protect themselves. These aren't just words. They're principles worth dying for. Helen paused, letting the weight of those words settle over the room. But they're also principles worth living for, worth fighting for every day. In every decision you make, in every order you follow or refuse to follow. Because that's what service really means. It's not about blind obedience. It's about choosing every day to be part of something bigger than yourself. She walked back to the desk and picked up her coffee cup, taking a sip of the now cold liquid. I'm going to be driving across this country for the next few months, visiting every state. Seeing what Rachel and I fought for, what all of you are fighting for. And I'm going to be asking questions, hard questions, about whether we're living up to the values we claim to defend. Helen set down the cup and looked around the room one more time. If any of you want to be part of that conversation, if you want to help me understand what service means to your generation, you know how to find me. I'll be the woman in the beat-up van with too many questions and not enough answers. She started toward the door again, then paused. And remember, Rachel, Dawson didn't die so you could serve blindly. She died so you could serve wisely. Don't let her down. This time, when Helen walked out of the room, she could hear something different behind her. Not just the scraping of chairs as soldiers stood to salute, but the sound of voices. Questions being asked, conversations being started. The beginning of the kind of dialogue that Rachel would have wanted. For the first time in 3 years, Helen felt like she was finally moving in the right direction. 3 weeks later, Helen's phone wouldn't stop ringing. She was somewhere outside Nashville, pulled over at a truck stop to fix a loose fan belt. When the calls started coming in, first from General Hayward, then from soldiers she'd never heard of, then from journalists who'd somehow gotten wind of what had happened at Fort Liberty. "Ma'am, this is Sergeant First Class Maria Rodriguez from Fort Campbell," the latest caller said. "I heard about what you did at Liberty. My unit would like to invite you to speak." Helen hung up and turned off the phone. She'd been naive to think that what happened in that conference room would stay contained. In the age of social media and instant communication, nothing stayed secret for long, especially not a story about a mysterious veteran with a classified past who challenged 60 soldiers to think critically about their service. The van's engine coughed to life, and Helen pulled back onto the highway. Rachel's photograph still sat on the dashboard, but now it was accompanied by a small stack of business cards from soldiers who'd approached her after the presentation. Young faces with old questions, looking for guidance from someone who'd been where they were going. She'd thrown most of the cards away. This wasn't supposed to be about building a movement or becoming some kind of guru. It was supposed to be about keeping a promise to a dead friend. But the calls kept coming. Helen's phone buzzed again, and this time she recognized the number. General Hayward. Against her better judgment, she answered. "I told you no press," she said without preamble. "I didn't call any press," Hayward replied. "But I can't control what the soldiers in that room chose to do with their own social media accounts." "What are you talking about?" "Check your email when you get a chance. Or better yet, look up #RachelDawson on any social platform." Helen felt her stomach drop. "Marcus, what did you do?" "I didn't do anything. Your story did this. The soldiers you spoke to, they've been sharing it, talking about it, using it to start conversations about what service really means." Helen pulled over again, this time at a rest area overlooking a valley filled with rolling hills and farmland. She turned on her phone's data and searched for the hashtag Hayward had mentioned. The results made her dizzy. Hundreds of posts, thousands of shares, videos of soldiers talking about duty and sacrifice and the importance of questioning authority. Photos of Rachel's memorial page being shared by people who'd never heard her name a month ago. And at the center of it all, grainy cell phone footage of Helen's presentation at Fort Liberty. Someone had recorded it despite the no-camera rule, and now it was spreading across the internet like wildfire. "This is a nightmare," Helen whispered. "This is what Rachel wanted," Hayward said gently. "This is why she made that choice in Jalous Valley. She knew you had something important to say, and she wanted to make sure you survived to say it. I never wanted to be a public figure. I never wanted to be the face of some movement, and don't be. But don't run away from it either. Use it." Helen watched a military convoy pass by on the highway below. Young soldiers headed to who knows where, for who knows what purpose. In a few hours, those soldiers would probably see the video of her presentation. They'd start asking their own questions about duty and honor and the price of service. "Use it how?" she asked. "Turn it into something constructive. You're already driving across the country. Why not make it official? Visit bases, talk to soldiers, help them understand what you've learned. That's not what this trip is about, isn't it? You said you wanted to see what you and Rachel fought for. Well, what you fought for is sitting in barracks and mess halls all across this country, trying to figure out how to serve with honor in a complicated world." Helen closed her eyes and leaned back in the driver's seat. Through the open windows, she could hear the sound of wind through the trees, the distant hum of traffic, the ordinary sounds of a country at peace. A country that Rachel had died to protect. "If I do this," Helen said slowly, "I do it my way. No handlers, no script, no sugarcoating the hard truths." "Agreed. And I want something in return. Name it." "I want access to Rachel's full military record. Everything. Including the classified stuff." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Helen, that's not something I can just... Then find someone who can. Because if I'm going to be telling her story, I want to make sure I'm telling all of it." Another pause, then a sigh. "I'll make some calls." "Thank you, Helen. For what it's worth, I think Rachel would be proud of what you're doing." Helen looked at the photograph on her dashboard, at Rachel's confident smile and bright eyes. "I hope so, Marcus. Because I'm about to honor her memory in ways that are going to make a lot of people very uncomfortable." After hanging up, Helen sat in the van for a long time, watching the sun set over the Tennessee hills. She thought about the path that had brought her here from the isolation of her Portland house to a North Carolina highway to this moment of decision. She thought about the young soldiers who'd be watching her video tonight, wrestling with questions about duty and honor that had no easy answers. She thought about Rachel, alone in that valley, making the choice that would define both their legacies. Finally, she started the van and pulled back onto the highway. She had a promise to keep, but now she understood that the promise was bigger than just seeing the country. It was about helping others see it too, not through rose-colored glasses, but with the clear eyes of people who understood the true cost of freedom. The road ahead was long, and Helen was just getting started. 6 months later, Helen sat in a congressional hearing room, facing a panel of lawmakers who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. The room was packed with reporters, veterans, advocates, and military personnel, all drawn by the controversy that had been building around Helen's cross-country tour. What had started as a simple promise to a dead friend had become something much larger and much more dangerous to the people who preferred their military stories simple and sanitized. "Mrs. Monroe," Congressman Bradley Whitfield began, his voice carrying the particular blend of authority and condescension that Helen had learned to recognize in politicians. "You've made some very serious allegations about military leadership and operational security. Do you have evidence to support these claims?" Helen looked down at the folder in front of her. 3 weeks ago, General Hayward had kept his promise and delivered Rachel's complete military record, including the classified after-action reports from Jalars Valley. What Helen had found there had changed everything. "Congressman Whitfield," she said calmly, "I have more evidence than you're prepared to handle." She opened the folder and pulled out a document marked with classification stamps and redaction marks. "This is the original mission briefing for Operation Dustgate, the mission that resulted in the death of Rachel Dawson and 4 other American soldiers. According to this document, military intelligence had confirmed the presence of at least 30 enemy combatants in the target area. The briefing given to my unit indicated we'd be facing minimal resistance." A murmur ran through the gallery. Whitfield's face flushed slightly. "Mrs. Monroe, you cannot discuss classified information in an open hearing." "I can discuss declassified information," Helen interrupted, holding up another document. "This is a declassification order signed yesterday by the Secretary of Defense." Apparently, someone in the Pentagon decided the American people deserved to know the truth about what happened in Jalars Valley. The murmur in the gallery grew louder. Helen could see reporters frantically typing on their phones, and she knew that within minutes, the story would be spreading across every news platform in the country. Furthermore, Helen continued, pulling out another document. "This is the communication log from the night of the mission. It clearly shows that my unit requested extraction 3 times after discovering the true nature of the enemy presence. All 3 requests were denied. Congresswoman Janet Martinez, who'd been quiet until now, leaned forward in her chair. Mrs. Monroe, are you alleging that American soldiers were deliberately sent into a trap? I'm alleging that someone decided the intelligence my unit could gather was worth more than our lives. I'm alleging that Rachel Dawson and 4 other soldiers died not for their country, but for someone's career ambitions. The room erupted. Reporters shouted questions, military personnel argued in heated whispers, and the panel struggled to maintain order. Through it all, Helen sat calmly, her hand resting on Rachel's photograph, which she'd placed on the table in front of her. "Order!" Whitfield shouted, banging his gavel. "I will have order in this chamber." When the room finally quieted, Helen continued as if nothing had happened. "For 6 months, I've been traveling across this country, speaking to soldiers about duty and honor and the price of service. What I've learned is that there are thousands of men and women in uniform who are asking the same questions I've been asking. Questions about whether their sacrifices matter. Questions about whether their leaders see them as human beings or just chess pieces to be moved around a board." She stood up, ignoring the protests from the panel. "I've also learned that there are leaders like General Marcus Hayward who understand that accountability isn't the enemy of military effectiveness. It's the foundation of it. Leaders who know that soldiers fight better when they trust that their lives won't be wasted on missions designed to cover up someone else's mistakes." Helen picked up Rachel's photograph and held it up for the room to see. Rachel Dawson died believing she was serving something bigger than herself. She died believing that her sacrifice would protect innocent people and defend American values. What she actually died for was a classified intelligence operation that was already compromised before we ever set foot in that valley. The room was dead silent now. Even the reporters had stopped typing, transfixed by the raw emotion in Helen's voice. "But here's what I want you to understand," Helen said, her voice rising slightly. "Rachel's death wasn't meaningless because the mission was flawed. Her death was meaningful because she chose to save my life, knowing that I would survive to tell this story. She died so that someone would be alive to ask these questions, to demand better from the system we all serve." Helen walked around the table, moving closer to the panel. "I'm not here to destroy the military or undermine national security. I'm here to remind you that the men and women who serve deserve leaders who value their lives as much as they value their missions. They deserve commanders who won't send them into harm's way unless there's a clear, achievable objective that serves the national interest." She stopped directly in front of Congressman Whitfield. "And they deserve representatives who will ask the hard questions when those standards aren't met." Whitfield cleared his throat nervously. "Mrs. Monroe, while your concerns are noted, we must also consider the broader implications of second-guessing military leadership." "The broader implications," Helen interrupted, "are that we might actually start winning the wars we fight instead of just prolonging them until everyone forgets why we started them." The gallery erupted again, but this time with applause. Helen could see military personnel throughout the room standing and clapping, their faces reflecting a mixture of vindication and hope. As the chaos continued around her, Helen looked down at Rachel's photograph one more time. Her friend's smile seemed brighter somehow, more real than it had in years. "I kept my promise, Rachel," she whispered. "I saw what we fought for, and now I'm going to make sure it was worth what you gave up." 1 year later, Helen stood on the steps of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, Rachel's photograph in her hands. The black granite wall stretched out before her, reflecting the faces of visitors who'd come to remember their own losses. The past year had been a whirlwind of change. The Congressional hearing had led to investigations, resignations, and reforms that were still being implemented. Helen's story had sparked a national conversation about military accountability and the treatment of veterans. Books had been written, documentaries filmed, and policies changed. But for Helen, the most important change was the simplest one. She was no longer hiding. "You made quite an impression on those politicians," a familiar voice said behind her. Helen turned to see General Hayward approaching, dressed in civilian clothes, but still carrying himself with military bearing. "Marcus," she said warmly, "I wasn't sure you'd come. Wouldn't miss it. Besides, I wanted to see how the story ends." "It doesn't end," Helen said, looking back at the wall. "It just continues. Different chapters, same themes. Any regrets?" Helen considered the question. The past year had cost her whatever privacy she'd managed to maintain, but it had also given her something she'd never expected: purpose. The speaking tour that had grown out of her congressional testimony had taken her to military bases around the world, where she'd met thousands of soldiers grappling with the same questions she'd wrestled with. "Ask me again in 10 years, she said finally, "when we know whether any of this actually made a difference." It's already making a difference. The new accountability protocols, the whistleblower protections, the mental health resources, those are policy changes. Helen interrupted. "I'm talking about cultural change. Whether the next generation of military leaders will remember that their first duty is to the people they command, not the missions they're assigned." Hayward nodded thoughtfully. "You know, there's something I never told you about that day at Fort Liberty." "What's that?" "I wasn't there by accident. I've been tracking your movement across the country, reading the reports from other bases about this mysterious veteran who was asking uncomfortable questions." Helen raised an eyebrow. "You were investigating me?" "I was trying to understand who you were, what you represented, whether you were a threat to military discipline or—" He paused. "Something else." "And what did you conclude?" "That you were exactly what we needed. Someone with the credibility to ask the hard questions and the courage to demand honest answers." Helen touched Rachel's photograph gently, feeling the worn edges beneath her fingers. "Rachel would have been better at this than me," she said. Quietly, she always knew how to inspire people without making them angry. Maybe. But she also knew that sometimes anger is the appropriate response. Sometimes the system needs to be shaken up before it can be fixed. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching other visitors leave flowers and flags at the base of the memorial. Young and old, military and civilian, all united by their connection to the sacrifice represented by the names on the wall. "I got a call yesterday," Helen said eventually, "from a soldier at Fort Bragg. She wanted to report a safety violation that her commander was covering up. 3 years ago, she would have kept quiet and hoped for the best. And now? Now, she knows she has options. She knows there are people who will listen and systems in place to protect her." Helen pulled out her phone and showed Hayward a photo. Dozens of soldiers gather around a makeshift memorial in Afghanistan, holding pictures of fallen comrades. "This was sent to me by a unit in Kabul. They started something they call Promise, taking photos of their fallen friends to significant places, sharing stories about who they were beyond their service records. Like what you did with Rachel. Exactly like what I did with Rachel. Except now there are hundreds of people doing it. Thousands, maybe." Helen put the phone away and looked back at the memorial wall. "You know what I realized somewhere around? Mile marker 50,000. This was never about the drive across the country. It was about the conversations, the connections, the way people respond when you treat their service as something sacred instead of something owed. And the van?" Helen laughed. "Still running. Rodriguez's maintenance schedule is apparently bulletproof, though I'm thinking about upgrading to something with better air conditioning. Where to next? There's a military academy in Colorado that wants to include Rachel's story in their ethics curriculum. and a VA hospital in Texas that's starting a program for veterans dealing with survivor's guilt. Helen paused. Turns out there are a lot of us. That surprises you? It did. I thought I was the only one carrying this kind of weight. But it turns out that every unit, every deployment, every mission leaves someone behind who has to figure out how to live with what they've seen and what they've lost. Helen walked closer to the memorial wall and found a spot where the black granite reflected her face clearly. For a moment, she could see both herself and Rachel in the reflection, side by side like they'd been in that photograph. The other thing I realized, she said, still looking at her reflection, is that Rachel didn't just die to save my life. She died to save my ability to live with myself afterward. She knew that if I didn't make it home, I'd never forgive myself. And she knew that if I did make it home, but didn't do anything meaningful with the time she gave me, I'd never forgive myself for that either. Sounds like she knew you pretty well. Better than I knew myself, apparently. Helen placed Rachel's photograph against the base of the memorial, propping it up next to a small American flag someone else had left behind. I'm not leaving this here, she said, seeing Hayward's questioning look, just giving her a moment to visit with the others, to be part of something bigger than our story. They stepped back and watched as other visitors noticed the photograph, some stopping to read the small placard Helen had attached. Rachel Dawson, Ghost Company 7. She died, so others could live to ask the hard questions. You know, Hayward said quietly, I think she'd be proud of what you've built. It's not finished yet, Helen replied. I don't think it ever will be, but that's okay. The best promises aren't the ones you keep once and forget about. They're the ones you keep every day, in small ways, for as long as you're alive to keep them. Helen picked up Rachel's photograph and walked back toward the parking area where her van waited. The old vehicle looked exactly the same as it had that day outside Fort Liberty, except for the new bumper stickers that had accumulated over the months, messages of support from veterans groups, base coordinates from places she'd visited, and a simple white sticker with black letters that read, Promise Keeper. One more question, Hayward said as they reached the van. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you just fixed that hose and driven away that day? If we'd never met, never had that conversation? Helen considered this, key in hand, van door half open. I think about it sometimes, she said finally. But then I remember something Rachel used to say. The universe doesn't give you choices, Helen. It gives you opportunities to become who you're supposed to be. She climbed into the van and started the engine. Through the open window, she could see her reflection in the memorial wall one more time, but now she looked different, stronger, more complete. See you around, Marcus, she said. And thanks for seeing me that day, for helping me remember who I used to be. Thank you, he replied, for helping me remember why any of this matters. Helen put the van in drive and pulled out of the parking area. In her rearview mirror, she could see Hayward standing at attention, watching her leave. On the dashboard, Rachel's photograph caught the afternoon sunlight, her smile as bright and confident as ever. Next to it, Helen had placed the silver coin General Hayward had given her, along with dozens of others from soldiers she'd met along the way, each one representing a conversation, a connection, a small victory in the larger battle for accountability and honor. Okay, girl, Helen said to the photograph as she merged onto the highway. Where to next? The road stretched out ahead of her, empty and full of possibilities. Somewhere out there were more soldiers with questions that needed asking, more stories that needed telling, more promises that needed keeping. Helen Monroe, formerly of Ghost Company 7, currently of wherever the road led, her pressed the accelerator and disappeared into the American landscape, carrying the weight of the dead and the hope of the living in equal measure. The van's engine hummed smoothly, Rodriguez's maintenance holding true. The sun was setting behind her, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that reminded her of Rachel's hair. And for the first time since Jowler's Valley, Helen Monroe was exactly where she was supposed to be. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.